My first affirmation event 12 years ago in DC, and it's been a wonderful friendship. And he's a great, spectacular author of many books, written for National Geographic and many other companies. You're going to just absolutely love this. So, Andrew. Thank you, Randall. Can you all hear me okay?
Whoa, that's really loud. Can we good now? So Randall, I did meet him at the very first affirmation party that he came to, which was a swim party. And this is a picture from that affirmation swim party. My first impression of Randall. I can't do the volume, so. Sorry. I thought I would open with this picture. I thought we'd start with pictures from my mission. This is what I thought going on a mission was going to be like when I went to the MTC. How's the sound? Can you guys? It's scratchy, isn't it? A little bit. Huh? Okay. Keep talking. Okay. How's that? Better? Better? Yes? Better?
Yes, better.
Great, much better. Let's leave it there. That's great. Thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming. I am honored and touched that you would be interested enough to come. And I'm here today to talk about my book, The Black Penguin, which is for sale downstairs at our book table right after this talk. But I open with this picture because I knew I was gay at about the age of 6. And my very first realization was reading the Children's Book of Mormon cartoon version. I realized very quickly that I had a Lamanite fetish. And I am a white gay male, which makes me the least interesting person on the LGBTQIA plus scale. So you have to bear with me. But this realization of our sexuality starts very young, and I think straight people don't often understand that. And we become ourselves month after month, year after year, and about the same age, aside from the Children's Book of Mormon, which was my secret porn stash as a 6, 7-year-old. My other pornography was the World Atlas, and I was obsessed with it, and National Geographic. And it's what I read and learned about the whole world, and I just saw it as a way for me to escape. So at the same age that I realized I had a Lamanite fetish, I also told my parents, I came out to them and said, someday I'm going to work for National Geographic. And they said, okay, that's fine. But I made that decision at 7, and it ended up coming true. I'm a writer, I take pictures, I've been working with them for about a decade now. I've done over 40 assignments for them, and this is me on assignment in Texas, where I got to ride a Longhorn, and I took pictures on the back of a Longhorn, which is not very easy to do. And here I am in my office in Rwanda, live blogging right after I had tracked some chimpanzees in the mountains. And then this was the best day I've ever had on the job. This is in Chengdu in the south of China. And I was obsessed with pandas, and I got to go to a panda reserve. And they said, if you're really good and you take a chemical shower and wear rubber gloves and a hospital gown and a mask, we will let you sit next to this baby panda. Now this baby is about 7 months old. This was the end of her shift. She was a little tired. They were putting honey on her paws. She was licking them. And I sat down, and pandas are not soft like a stuffed animal. They're very coarse, like a brush. And I sat down there, and I couldn't resist the urge. When you're this close to a baby panda, I ripped off my mask, and I kissed the panda. And the handlers and the Chinese, they went nuts. They started screaming at me in Mandarin and saying how awful it was. But I shared this picture this morning with our youth, and I said to them, don't ever let anybody tell you who you can't kiss. Because you know when you know. And I knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and my best day on the job at National Geographic. And this is the last assignment that I just finished this summer. I hiked across Jordan. So I hiked from the Syrian border all the way to Saudi Arabia, 450 miles on foot. Crazy landscapes in the path of Moses and Jesus and Muhammad, and it was was amazing and it changed my life, but one of the most difficult journeys that I've ever done. Now, I'm a travel writer, which means that I write about travel. I write about people and places. And so when I sat down to write this book, like all my other books, it was about a country, it was about a place. And when I wrote it, my agent came back to me and said, this is nice and all, this book about Antarctica, but you're hiding something. You're not sharing your truth. You're not telling your whole story. You're editing yourself. So I want you to go back and write it again. And that's not easy. This isn't a one-day project. This is a year-and-a-half project. So I scrapped my original manuscript, and I sat down, and I just started writing random things. And what came out was my life, and all of the gay parts of it, and all the Mormon parts of it, and all the different pieces of me that make me became a part of this book. So I'm going to share a couple of passages, if everyone's okay with that, from my book. Just to give you some context, this book really is about Antarctica, but not really. The first scene I'm going to read to you is from my mission. And I've always wanted to write about my mission because for all of us who've been on missions, these are life-changing experiences that bless you and traumatize you and stay with you your whole life. And I was called to Ukraine, Russian-speaking, in a mission that's no longer existing because they're in the course of having a civil war, to give you context of where I served my mission. And most of my companions were native, so I was speaking Russian all the time. And I didn't want this to be a coming out book, but this is my coming out scene, because I came out in Russian as a missionary to my companion. And the way that you say gay in Russian is голубой, which means light blue. So those of you wearing light blue, that means something in Russian. Summer in Ukraine is a strip of sunflowers beneath a blue sky. It's digging potatoes in the black earth and sipping cold kvass from a peddler's reusable glass. It's the trolley bus smell of body odor, garlic, and unfiltered tobacco. The hot water disappears, so I wash my shirts in a pail of water boiled on the stove. After hours of scrubbing and rinsing, I hung them in a row on the balcony like a ghostly legion of missionaries flapping in the wind. Summer meant turning so tan that when I stood naked in front of the mirror, it still looked like I was wearing a white shirt. It meant warm nights beneath a single sheet, shifting left to right, sleepless under the dark ceiling. Summer meant that my 21st birthday was coming soon, and after that I would be leaving the starkness of Ukraine and going back to America, where my life was laid out like a blueprint. Temple marriage to a good wife, a steady parade of obedient children, a secure corporate job to pay for the 4-bedroom house and the orthodontist and the viola lessons and dance classes, and every spare hour spent in glad service to the church. I'd always known this, I'd always accepted it, but now that I was just a few months away from the rest of my life, I was panicked. I had always done everything the church had ever asked of me. I was an Eagle Scout, I'd been through the temple, I'd read the Book of Mormon over 20 times in English, 5 times in Russian. But what the church wanted me to do next, to marry a woman and make babies, that was impossible. My anxiety swelled like the heat outside, and for a few weeks I stopped sleeping altogether. Each night, after my companion fell asleep in his bed, I slipped into the other room and read books. Some nights it was the Bible. Others it was Chekhov or Akhmatova. Lifted from the shelves of the apartment we rented, I read until I could no longer read, and I prayed so that I could fall back asleep. One night, Elder Shapovnik walked into the room with a pair of shorts. Like that? Yeah. Okay. One night, this is the racy part of the book. This is the nude scene. So, one night, Elder Shapovnik walked into the room with a pair of shorts pulled halfway over his garments, rubbing his eyes in the light. "What is it?" he whispered in Russian. Shapovnik was a recent convert from Kiev, and he spoke no English. "Come back to bed," he urged, but I was only staring at the peeling pink wallpaper. If I looked him in the eye, I might cry, and if I cried, I would tell him, and if I told him, then I could never go back to the way things were before. You've been up every night. Something is going on, and you need to tell me what it is. Shipovnik was several years older than me, but he was also a newbie, new to the mission, new to the church. I just can't tell you, I said. It seemed unfair to burden him with my biggest secret. Besides, Shipovnik was straight. Before he became a Mormon, he'd been quite the active heterosexual. I waited silently, staring blankly at my Ukrainian friend, hoping it would all just go away. There was no way out of this one, and when I realized that, a trembling tear spilled out of one eye, and then another. Elder Shipovnik placed his hand on my shoulder, a kind touch. "Just tell me," he whispered. The silence continued. We were two friends in a standoff, though I wanted him to win. I was so afraid of telling him the truth, but in the end, I was more afraid of never telling anyone at all. "I think I'm light blue," I spoke, using the Russian slang for gay. For the first time in my life, I said the words out loud, and though my heart jumped inside me and I felt my face go red, there were no crashing cymbals or secret police barging through the door. Elder Shipovnik sat silent across from me, his arms folded in his lap. This was not what he expected, but his face seemed calmed and his eyes were clear. "God knows how you feel," he said. "God understands what you are feeling, Elder Evans." It was such a simple idea, one that I had shared before when church members came to me with their problems, that their son was in jail, or they had no more food for their children. But now, this new convert was speaking those same words back to me. God knew that I was gay. Of course he did. "Now come to sleep," said Elder Shipovnik, as if nothing had happened at all. He showed no fear of me and acted no differently than before. That I was gay remained our secret. He never told the other missionaries. He never turned me in. He could have. Most missionaries would have felt it their duty to report me to the mission president. But Elder Shipovnik worked next to me until the very last day of my mission, when we walked the August streets of Kharkov, stopping total strangers to let them know all about Jesus Christ and his universal understanding. So after my mission, I came home and I did what you should never do. Those of you with missionary-age kids don't ever do this. I came home from my mission, and 5 days later I was at BYU, attending classes, total culture shock. And BYU is where I came out in many different ways, as we do, to myself, to my friends, to my bishop, and everything that followed was a lot of drama. And I'm wearing this pin because I'm just amazed that it even exists, that there is a rainbow flag next to BYU. Because that was not the case 20 years ago. So this happened 20 years ago when I first met with my bishop back at BYU, and I had come out to him. 2 years after my first missionary interview, I was back in that same shoebox of a room in the basement of my college dorm, listening to the cranky washing machine banging against the wall, while my new bishop carefully explained to me how not to be a homosexual. "You can start by lowering your voice." His voice got deeper. "And change the way you walk. Men walk tall and proud, head up, shoulders out." He puffed up his chest in demonstration. "You need a different haircut too," he said. "That's part of the repentance process." I wasn't sure from which sin I needed to repent, since I was still very much a virgin, and I had the same missionary haircut I'd had when I departed Ukraine 2 weeks prior. Still, I believed that my bishop was inspired to guide me in my life. He had the gift of discernment and leadership, and I listened closely to his instructions. "If you start acting like a real man, then you'll become a real man." He explained lightheartedly, "Don't you worry about a thing. I'm going to help you, and the Lord is going to help you, and we're going to find you a wife. This semester even." How does that sound? It sounded like my greatest fear had just been given a deadline. And I regretted opening up my soul to this man who smelled like hair tonic and mothballs. I masked my dread with an embarrassed smile. Now don't go telling anybody what you just told me, he continued with his Utah twang. You are not a homosexual, and nobody else will ever have to know about this. It will be our little secret. And once you're married, your wife will never have to know. Got it? The bishop was true to his word and set me up on a blind date with the oldest old maid in our ward, a 23-year-old returned missionary from Alaska, with a fondness for sewing quilts and wearing ankle-length skirts. We spent the evening discussing quilts before I went back to her apartment to uneuphemistically examine her quilt squares. The date ended at 9:30 with a brief handshake and a wave goodbye. How was your date? Asked my bishop the following Sunday. We met weekly now in the private room in the basement where I could report my progress towards heterosexuality. It was fun, I answered. Did you schedule a second date? He asked. No, I had not, but I designed a quilt for one of my art classes. It would be a map of the world, but all the countries would be different pieces of fabric. My date said she would help me. Are you sure that art is the best major for someone like you? Asked the bishop. A lot of homosexuals do art and theater, so you might be surrounding yourself with the wrong kind of influence. He tapped his hand on my knee. I think you should pray about changing your major. Now, in the alphabetical list of wrist-slitting majors offered at Brigham Young University, accounting, apologies to the accountants, actuarial science, bioinformatics, only two held any appeal for me. After art, there was geography. And while I was ill-informed about what it was that geographers did after college, it was the closest thing that I could find to pursue my dream of working for National Geographic. Besides, doing art at BYU was problematic. For her senior project, a friend of mine had crafted 25 enormous ceramic spheres, each with a single opening sculpted in the unmistakable form of a vulva. After 2 weeks and lots of young Mormon children crawling in and out of the vagina sculptures at the art show, some scandalized mother complained to the administration. Until then, no man wanted to admit that he recognized the abstract display which I think was the whole point of the installation. Then there was the time when the Art Museum opened their exhibit of authentic bronze casts from the original sculptures by Auguste Rodin. I was ecstatic, but 4 days later, after shrill complaints from students, parents, faculty, and the administration, the university closed the exhibit and nailed all those cold, naked statues back into the crates from whence they came. Aside from the overt sensuality of the kiss, BYU president Merrill Bateman claimed that Rodin's John the Baptist made it seem like the ancient prophet was masturbating. Unarguable proof that BYU's president knew nothing about art or masturbation. When they banned Rodin, I officially changed my major to geography. So I majored in geography. I was an art major for the first year, then I switched to geography. I did Russian and French. And because of my problems at BYU, I graduated early. I got out in 3 years instead of 4, because there was an incentive for me to be gone. And I moved to Europe, and I pursued my dreams, and I got my very first book deal, which was to write a guidebook to Ukraine. And my budget was so small, I actually hitchhiked across Europe to Ukraine, and I was sleeping in barns and in caves and in farmers' fields and researching this book. There had never been a guidebook written to Ukraine in English before. And I was particularly interested in the history of the Hasidic Jews, which begins in Ukraine. And we're all Mormons here. We know that we all wish we were Jewish. Mormons have this crazy Semitophilia where we want to be them. And so I was fascinated by this, and I went to the place where the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, was buried. And I met a rabbi there. And he opened up his synagogue to me and took me around, and this was my experience with him. So we're in Ukraine. early 2000s. Even now, in winter's fading grasp, this place still felt dead, with its tired donkeys and coal-heated houses plopped around the broken ruins of a Polish castle. "Today, I am the only Jew in the village," said the rabbi. And then he asked rather unexpectedly, "Are you married?" That question again. The older I got, the more I was asked it, though usually only by Mormon mothers with available daughters. "Yes," I lied, because that was the easiest answer to give. I felt married to Brian. But if I tried telling the truth, this whole moment would be ruined. The Hasidic rabbi would leave me in the cold or cast me out as an imposter, shutting my window into his secret world. I panicked with the fear of rejection, even by this stranger. "What's your wife's name?" he asked, calling my bluff. Brianna." I invented an unconvincing woman's name and wondered how grave a sin it is to lie to a rabbi. "How long have you been married?" 7 years. "How many children do you have?" he asked, then waited for my answer. "No children, yet," I said, staring down at the ground. 7 years and no kids? What's wrong with her? The rabbi shook his head as if my childless marriage was the greatest misfortune a man might suffer. "What's wrong with her?" I thought, fighting a smirk. "By now you should have at least 4 or 5 children," he said, showing 5 white fingertips like bobbing heads on his fingerless gloves. I nodded, imagining me now, a penniless guidebook writer with 5 kids to support. "Have you brought her to the doctor? He might help you find out your wife's problem." He really was not going to let this go. I'd lied to the rabbi, and now that lie was turning into a tangled tree of ridiculous lies. I imagined Brian spread in stirrups as the gynecologist delivered the diagnosis. "Well, sir, it seems your wife is unable to conceive because he is a man." The rabbi saw my discomfort and felt sorry for me, a nebbish without sons, married to a barren woman who at that moment was all alone at home in America. I did not try to correct the picture he'd imagined. "Come, eat," he said, leading me down into the heated synagogue. I was grateful for the plate of fish and potatoes and greens. The food was plain, but it was fresh and hot, and the best I'd eaten in days. After lunch, the rabbi showed me around the place. Besides the kitchen and dining room, there were rooms for prayer, a separate synagogue for women, and a library. Aside from the candlesticks and Hebrew banners, it felt a lot like a Mormon church. All it needed was a basketball court. "This is our mikvah," said the rabbi, leading me into the warmest room of all, which was covered in white tiles, with steps leading down into a deep square pool that glowed aquamarine with crystal clear water. The bath resembled the font where I was baptized back in northern Ohio, oozing warmth and purity. "This is rainwater. We collected from the roofs and purified ourselves. Why don't you go in? Just dunk yourself into the mikvah. It's quite nice," the rabbi offered. Thank you, but no," I declined. All day I felt so cold and gritty, wearing the same clothes that I'd worn 3 days before. I felt dirty, too dirty to bathe in such a clean and spiritual place. "Really, you should just go in the water. That's all it takes to be Jewish. You're already circumcised." I nodded yes. The rabbi was getting personal. "Well, then you just bathe in the mikvah," and he snapped his fingers. "You're Jewish." He smiled and extended his hand toward the water like an usher pointing my way to the seat. I'd always thought that being Jewish was a bit more complicated than that. You had to have the name, and the mother and the family, the aunts down in Florida, all the holidays and languages and bread, the sarcasm and tragedy, some peace in the history of suffering, and a lifetime of otherness in a world of steepled churches and Santa Claus. I was not Jewish, and I was no longer Mormon. I was a Gentile to both tribes, wandering through a land where I'd once been a missionary myself. "Bathe in the mikvah," the rabbi insisted, nearly pushing me in, but I was still afraid. It was God, I thought, staring into the glassy blue water before me. I was afraid of God. After my friends, my school, my church, and my family had rejected me, I was waiting for God to do the same. I was waiting for him to lash down at me, to cut me off from everything I loved, and then fill my life with punishment and hurt. I'd come to expect the worst from life, except, what if God had led me to this place? All right, I said to the rabbi. Just take off all your clothes, everything off. The rabbi motioned his own hands down his body. Go down into the middle of the pool and then dip yourself under the water 3 times, he said. That's all? He smiled and nodded, and then left the room and shut the door. I squatted down to test the water with my hand, warm, gentle water that rippled around my fingertips. Then I began stripping off the layers of clothes. First the dingy gray cashmere with holes in the sleeves, then the shirt from my rowing days, and my jeans that smelled like the smoky filth of overnight trains. I removed Brian's ring and dropped it safely into my pants pocket, then finally kicked my way out of my long underwear. I stared at my toes, pink from the cold, then broke the water with one foot. Falling slowly forward, I slid my naked body into the warm essence of the mikvah. The heated rainwater surrounded my shoulders, then washed over my head as I knelt down, eyes blinded with blue. I dipped myself under twice more, splash, splash, and then rose up, standing chest deep in the pool. The water dripped from my face, and though I was alone, I felt warm, clean, and secure. And so I simply wiped myself dry with my sweater and reluctantly stepped back into the gray clothing of the outside world. So writing guidebooks led to me eventually writing what I wanted to do, stories for National Geographic. And this was right around the same time as digital media was becoming more and more popular, and I wanted to tell stories online, and I was tired of the kind of very predictable travel that people were doing. So I'd always wanted to go to Antarctica. It seemed like the most impossible destination to get to on Earth. It was my lifelong dream. And I tried and tried and tried and kept failing. So finally I said, I've got to stop obsessing about the goal and focus on the journey getting there. And I realized that 98% of the way to Antarctica had roads. So I went to my editor and said, I'm going to take public transportation to Antarctica. And he let me do it. He agreed to it. So this is January 1st on the S2 Metro bus that passes National Geographic. I paid $1.35 and climbed on. Oh, why is it doing that? And I'm sending my first tweet from my iPhone 3 and leaving and taking off. And it was an amazing journey with lots of pitfalls along the way. This is in Colombia where a big boulder came down and smashed his car in front of us. That's our bus driver who went and rescued the people out of it. We had a lot of popped tires when we go from sea level up to 14,000 feet in the Altiplano of the Andes. I wasn't a science major. Apparently you have to let gas out of the tires or else they pop because it expands. And my inflatable pillow that I inflated at sea level in Peru exploded at 4 a.m. And I had inflated it at sea level after eating a bag of extra cheesy Doritos. So this moment was cheese dust all around. And I was suffering from altitude sickness, so they gave me this tea, and after 7 or 8 cups of this, I felt really, really good. This is coca, which is the primary ingredient in cocaine. And this was the first time I ever broke the word of wisdom. I've moved on to coffee since then. But as I was doing, I made it to Argentina finally, and at this point I think they were shocked that I made it this far. And the last distance, the whole of Argentina is 5,000 kilometers long, which is the same distance as New York to LA. And as I was going along making this journey, more and more people kind of began joining me in it as I was writing every day. This is my bus that actually took me there. And in the end, I made it to Antarctica. This is me landing in Antarctica. And it just so happened to be February 14th. The day that I landed in Antarctica. And I unfurled my National Geographic flag. My dream had come true. I was working for National Geographic. And then I left and went back onto the ship that had taken me there from Argentina. And I remembered that not only was it Valentine's Day, but it was my anniversary. Because our first date was on Valentine's Day. And you know, they gave me a million anniversaries, so pick one. And That was it, February 14th. I think my husband chose that because it was easier than remembering 2 days. He just remembers one day a year. But I was on this ship 14,000 miles away from him, and he said congratulations by text to me, and this is what I sent back to him. What is this? Very hair trigger, little candy heart where I proposed to him. And this was not the first time I proposed to my husband. Being Mormon, I proposed to him 4 weeks after meeting him. And all he did was laugh. He just laughed. He didn't say no, he didn't say yes, he just laughed and looked at me, like, for real? But we kept dating. And then we got engaged again a year after we'd been together. But there was no such thing as marriage for two men, and we just had our own understanding. We're now married. We made that decision. It was our understanding, and that's how we thought we would all live our lives. We never thought in a million years that we would actually be able to legally marry one another. And it just so happened that this day that I landed in Antarctica, they had also passed the marriage equality law in the District of Columbia, where we live. So that is why I sent him this heart. And he proposed to me, and thank goodness he said yes. And it was super romantic, and I was crying, I was happy, and I was 14,000 miles away from him in Antarctica. And this is the same day that I got engaged the third time. It's a very lonely place, it's a very beautiful place, it's a very cold place. I went swimming in Antarctica. The water is -1 degree here, Celsius, because it's below freezing because salt water freezes at a lower temperature. So there were icebergs in the water, and I went swimming for about a minute. Yeah, and wasn't there some talk about take a cold shower if you're, doesn't that sound boy kid backer talk? Anyway, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I still wanted to marry my husband after I swam. And yeah, and this picture is how I feel about church LGBT policy right now. This is how I feel. I feel like we are all there, there's millions of penguins, and we are only looking in one direction. And it is frustrating, and it is difficult. And I am no longer a member of the church, but I'm still as Mormon as I was when I was born. That doesn't rub off, it doesn't go away. And that is the frustration I feel, and it's part of the frustration that's in this book. So the last bit I'm going to read you is, I didn't want to write about it, because it was going to be, I thought it was going to be it was going to date the book too much, but I ended up writing about Prop 8. You guys probably don't know what that is, but let me explain. You guys, anybody not know what Prop 8 is? Okay. So, Prop 8 was a big deal. It passed in California with the help of the church and its many good soldiers in California. And I was devastated by that because we were engaged and we marched, we protested, and that's about this moment. But I should also say another element of this book is about my relationship with my family, which was very tenuous for all of this time. I mean, I was officially disowned by my parents and told never to come home again. And this was the counsel that they had received from their church leaders, which I hope is never the case anymore. But after a very long time, we came to some understanding and some healing, and this was part of the process. It was Brian who showed me the list online, name by name, every individual who'd given money to outlaw gay marriage. I found them quickly, first my brother and then his wife. $1,000 was a lot of money for a struggling family with 5 children. Yet this is what the church had instructed them to do, and they believed they were following God's living commandment. It was the same unwavering obedience that my family had followed for generations. My own ancestors had given up their homes and lives in Scotland and Wales and sailed the Atlantic, then pulled handcarts thousands of miles to Utah to build Zion. In 1878, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the Mormons' right to polygamy, my own great-great-grandfather was arrested and thrown into a federal penitentiary. Better than anybody else in America, Mormons can understand the inherent dangers of blending church and state. Yet now they had become the face of anti-gay discrimination and political manipulation. The blatant hypocrisy upset me. When Proposition 8 passed, I became sullen and depressed. A religion can't claim the rights promised by the Constitution while denying the same rights of others in the same breath, I whined out loud to Brian. Mormons can't have their separation of church and state and eat it too. Brian had a different attitude. Honey, this is probably the best thing in the world for us. By passing Prop 8, the church just hit the fast forward button on nationwide recognition of same-sex marriage. Prop 8 is unconstitutional. It will be overturned in federal courts, and it will end with the Supreme Court having to rule on a heap of lawsuits. But deep down, I still believe the church had God on its side. Just like that time, a week after I visited my very first gay bar, a freak tornado ripped through Salt Lake City and demolished the building in seconds. And some of you know the building I'm talking about. It's the only way, said Brian. The church has just made gay marriage a national conversation. They've advanced the movement by 10 years at least. I really should send the prophet a thank you card that says, Dear President Monson, thank you for forcing the Supreme Court to legalize my relationship and letting me marry my husband. It was wishful thinking. And now, nearly a year after Proposition 8 had passed, Brian and I were walking hand in hand past the White House, along with hundreds of thousands of protesters for equality. The marchers had come from all across America, from Alaska to Florida, Puerto Rico to Maine. We'd only come from 10 blocks away, but we all wanted the same thing, equality. We wanted the right to marry, the right to live in the same country as our spouse, the right to serve in the military, the right to go to school without being bullied or beaten. This nonsense had gone on too long. We had been too patient, too meek, too many lives had been ruined, and even after the explosion of empathy and acceptance in the media, there was still too much suffering. My family and church had the right to fight for their beliefs, but I had the right to fight for mine. Let the Mormons knock on doors in California. I was marching to the Capitol with the man I loved. We'd been together 9 years now, side by side through life, and yet the law still counted us strangers, mere roommates with different names and different passports. From the beginning, the world had told me that I did not belong. Every day at school, somebody was there to remind me with a slur or a punch. At church, they told me that I did not belong. Then they put me before a court and formally kicked me out of their fold. My own family had categorically excluded me from their lives. Now I felt half the country was shouting at me, claiming my kind did not belong in America. Only this time, I was shouting back. No longer timid or afraid, I was simply fed up, adding my own voice to the roar on the National Mall. The power of the crowd was like nothing I ever felt before. People were happy and hopeful. We believed the world would change. We believed that someday soon, we would be able to marry. I believed that someday I would have my family back. Already things had changed. Years had passed since my father had asked me never to come home again. And then came a different email, completely out of the blue. He was abnormally brief, no mention of the weather down in Texas or his attempts to trap the elusive armadillo in the backyard. I'm sorry, was all he wrote to me. He was sorry for what happened and how it happened. Come visit us sometime, he said. So I flew down to Houston and spent 3 days dancing around the hole in our relationship. Perhaps we wore different uniforms in the culture war that seemed to be splitting America in two, but he was still my father. No matter all the hurt that had come between us, I still loved him and everything that he was. And he still loved me, so very unmistakably gay, but on the inside, so Mormon, even now. Standing among hundreds of thousands of homosexuals on the Capitol steps, I felt proud to be me, a big, gay Mormon nerd who still knew all the capitals and countries of the world, who cried easily in touching movies or when hearing some old hymn, who still prayed to God like a kid begging Santa Claus for presents, and who was about to take a bus all the way to Antarctica. Reaching the bottom of the world had always seemed so elusive, as did getting married. Both were faraway dreams that I chased for a lifetime. Would I ever get there? I couldn't say, but I had come to a point in my life when I could actually try. After so much trying and failing, all I could do was march ahead. And that's what I did, and it's my mantra for everything, for life and for travel. And the title of this book, The Black Penguin, comes from the end of this journey to Antarctica, where I spotted this one in a zillion melanistic penguin that's all black. I took a picture of it. It went viral because it's the only recorded instance of this ever happening in nature. And to me, it's a very powerful symbol of all of us in this room, how unique we are. And what I found, what troubles me, and I said this today to the youth, is that when we're in the church, those of us who don't fit in, those of us who are a little too unique or a little too different or somehow don't fit into the canon that is presented, the church is telling our story. People in the church are telling our story for us. But each of us owns our own story, which is why when I first wrote this story for National Geographic, it was about me taking a bus to Antarctica. And this was the journey that I took. 12,000 miles by public transportation through 15 countries in 9 states and making it to Antarctica. But there was more to my story, and that is why I added, as my husband calls it, the gay Mormon shit. But that's my story, that's what I live. And all of your stories matter. Each of you has a unique story. Each of you has a lived truth. And we can't let other people tell those stories for us. Because this is how we learn from each other, this is how we become a community, and in the truest sense, a community of saints. So, to wrap up, I'm just going to show you a quick video of 12,000 miles. Is that okay? Should I ask for a translate? In the end, we all get where we need to get to. That is the lesson that we can learn from the Mormon pioneers. We can learn it from each other. We have to endure to the end. We have to push forward. And even when it's the darkest and the most difficult, that is when we need to find joy. It's why I love the hymn, Come, Come, Ye Saints. And it's something that even somebody who's been excommunicated from the church and disenfranchised and all the rest of it, I can find power from my own Mormon beliefs and my own Mormon heritage about where the love and the joy of God can take us. And for me, it brought me to my husband, who is definitely my greatest treasure. He would be embarrassed if he knew I was sharing this picture. But I love him, and I feel like he is such a blessing in my life. And one thing I want to say is that we have to be so careful in this difficult era that we're in, with the church being where it is, with the gay community being where it is, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because so much of who I am is still Mormon. So much of the good things that I have in my life come from the church, and And I remind people of this, even my own husband. Some of the things you love about me, honey, are because I'm Mormon. So you just have to deal with it. And I would say that being raised a Mormon made me a better husband. And as LGBT people, we can learn a lot from the church. We can learn how to have better relationships. We can learn how to love and forgive and repent. And the same eternal truths that make any family and home a happier place, we can apply to our gay households. And in closing, I would just like to share a very personal story that happened just a couple weeks ago. I was in Africa with my in-laws celebrating a family reunion there, and I saw in the news that Hurricane Harvey was coming, and it was coming to Houston, where my parents live. And I was terrified, and I was worried about them. And I called my dad from Africa, and my dad was, he's been a bishop like 6 times, and he's a state patriarch, and he's like, we're fine, the water's not going to touch us, it's all good. And I didn't believe him. And I got on a plane and flew to Austin and rented the biggest, baddest Tonka truck I could get and filled it full of gas and food and water and drove into Houston. And when I got there, it was a war zone. My parents' entire neighborhood was underwater and under sewage. And their house was ruined. And not only was their house ruined, but in the entire ward and in their stake, they had hundreds of houses that were ruined. So I set about helping them out any way that I could. And the devastating part of a flood isn't the water, it's the contamination of everything. So imagine all the sewers in Houston being dumped into your parents' living room. That's what happened. And I remember it was a Sunday, and I had not been to sacrament meeting in 18 years. And I went to sacrament meeting because we were meeting there before we were going to go off and start. It was the only way I was going to get into my parents' house that the National Guard was going to let us in. And it wasn't a normal sacrament meeting. It was only 45 minutes long, which worked for me. That was all the church. It was a 45-minute block. And everybody was wearing their yellow shirts, and it was a very short sacrament meeting, and then it was a safety briefing, and then all the work crews head out. And I had worked alone with my sister for 3 days, stripping out wet carpets, throwing away old, furniture, all of my parents' earthly belongings. I just downsized their life by 90%, tossed it all out on the curb. And all of a sudden, the members came in, and they got to work right here. These are some members and some missionaries, and the Mormon Helping Hands were there, and they're an army. They're a veritable army. They showed up, 40 of them walked into the house, and just immediately started demoing everything, pulling off the drywall, pulling out all the insulation, moving everything. And I was so impressed and so grateful. My parents had just lost their home. And the love and outpouring of hospitality from the members in their ward, casseroles coming out your ears, and food every night, and can we do this for you, can we do this for you? They insisted I stay with the members. They wouldn't let me go get a hotel, and so I always had a place to stay. This wasn't a time for judgment, it was a time of everybody coming together and helping. And I was especially touched that they rescued my parents' piano. It was the one thing that they rescued from their house. Everything got destroyed. But this piano they've had for 60 years. I learned to play piano on it, as did a host of other children and grandchildren. And I saw this and watched this, and I remember, bossing them around. I said, it takes 5 guys to move a piano. Like, how do you know this? It's like, I'm Mormon. I've moved more pianos than a piano mover's moved. It's part of your Elders Quorum covenant. And so I saw them moving this piano, and I saw this outpouring of help and spirit, and I was so grateful to the church. And that's all I could think of was, I'm so grateful that my parents had the church. And then I thought, why don't we have this for the LGBT members of the church? Why is it in a time of disaster we have everyone pulling together and everyone helping out those in need? But are we doing the same for the LGBT members of the Mormon Church? What about our youth? What about a parent of a youth who's just come out of the closet? What about a struggling trans 20-something who is feeling suicidal? Why are we not rallying around them like this? We have certain skills, we have certain abilities, but we need to apply them where it matters most now. And so if you can take all these things I said, I know it's a lot, and I appreciate your time, But my message is one of hope. I've spent 20 years coming to the place I am. This has been my journey. It's unique to me. You all have your own journeys. You have your own stories. They matter. You need to tell them. You need to share them. But we need to remember the good. We need to hold on to the good. We need to have joy and help each other along the way. And most of all, we need to live the impossible, because the three things I thought I would never achieve, working for National Geographic, getting to Antarctica, and marrying a man, all came true. Thank you.
I don't know about you, but that was amazing, right?
Yes. We're not sure what we're doing, but I'll be downstairs at the book stand signing books right now.
We'll start here in about 10 minutes or less with our Affirm Talks, which are like TED Talks. We have people from all over the world who'll be giving brief 10-minute talks. If you'd like to join.
That was absolutely